Hi everyone, here is my take on Unit 9, Lesson 3. So in the last lesson we talked about GUI editors, and they have a lot of the same tools as HTML, and they make it easier for you to create your web pages without having to know all of the necessary HTML code. One thing that you do need to consider if you do use a GUI editor is you need to consider the users who may have a disability that use your web page, and if you have a disability yourself, um, you need to be careful about which GUI editor you use because they will not all be user friendly. So keep that in mind if you decide to use a GUI editor to design your web pages. So in our text, the section on creating web pages with a GUI editor, that is all of the labs for GUI editors. However, I'm not going to make you do the labs because of the fact that it requires a GUI editor, and not all of us have access to a GUI editor right now. If we were in school, then yes, I would have you do these labs to make you familiar with using a GUI editor. However, since everyone's not necessarily using a computer or not using the latest update of a computer, we're just going to skip the labs for this unit, but you should check them out. You should explore them because they're kind of relatively similar to what you've done in the past. The text uses the program called Blue Griffin. It's free, it's open source. So if you really do want to go that route, you can definitely try it out and let me know how it goes if you decide to do that. So HTML text editors versus GUI editors. There are several advantages and disadvantages to using and writing your code using a text editor, like we have been doing, and a GUI editor. It really depends on the preferences of yourself and what you like and what your project actually needs to have accomplished. If you need to get a project done quickly, then you're probably going to want to use a GUI editor because you don't want to spend all that time writing all of that code. However, if you do prefer HTML, there's benefits to that as well. In most cases, you may use both types. You can quickly create your website with a GUI editor and then advance it using, and that should say an HTML text editor. You can quickly advance it using the HTML code to make it more advanced because you'd be able to edit the code in the GUI editor. The text mentions that you may enjoy writing code manually and may enjoy a job in programming if this is the case. I do mention this as well. The text tells me to mention this, and I mention it as well, because we are getting to the end of this journey using the program. So there's only one more unit left after this. So those of you who are considering moving on and advancing in web design, JavaScript is the next course that you would probably take, and then you can advance to Java and C# from there, depending on what your needs are and what you want to do. So if you do actually enjoy sitting down and writing all of the code by hand, that's great. You may have a job in programming. If not, regardless of what you do, if you decide to advance in web design, and go more of the GUI editor route, it's good to have that knowledge of HTML, and we'll talk about why in just a minute. But let's move on. We're going to talk about some of the pros and cons, so advantages and disadvantages of using both text editors and GUI editors. So for the pros of the HTML text editor. So if you do another scripting language, and I was just talking about this in the previous slide, you must write in manually, and HTML is a good transition to that. JavaScript, there is no, GUI editor for JavaScript. You have to sit down and write everything. You can copy and paste, obviously, but you have to create your own code. If you know the HTML code, you can also modify the GUI code and make it more advanced. This is also beneficial. So if you do have some of that basic knowledge of HTML, your GUI code could be even more advanced and look much better. If you know the basics of HTML, you can update your pages to the latest version of HTML, because we'll talk about that when we get to the GUI editors. You always want to make sure that your pages are on the current version of HTML so they support more users. It's very important that you are on the latest version of HTML when you make a web page. And there wouldn't be any unnecessary in the tags, and the code would be very clear and very easy to read because you've written it yourself. We'll talk about why in a few minutes using the GUI editors. So some of the cons, these are the negatives of HTML text editors. It's time consuming, as a lot of you have found out. Writing code by hand in HTML, it takes a lot of time. So you need to keep that in mind when you are creating your web pages using HTML. You also have to keep up with the latest code standards. That doesn't change too often, but you still need to keep up with it so that your pages will be up to the latest version. Also, if you have a disability, you may have trouble entering all of that text, especially if you have issues with typing or if you are dyslexic. Some of the words and some of the tags and everything that you put on is going to be mixed up. So it's not always good to use a text editor if you do have a disability. So keep that in mind. That's one of the things that you do want to keep in the back of your head. And it may be too much attention. If you're only making one page, you don't want to spend hours upon hours on HTML code just to make one single page. So that's also something to keep in mind here. So now the pros of GUI editors. We're going to talk about GUI editors. Pros of it, it's very easy to use and doesn't need any special training, especially like programs like Dreamweaver. Helps to buy the book so you know what you're doing, or there's training provided by Adobe so you can do it without too much background knowledge. GUI editors place code into files for you. They actually put everything into a nice, neat little folder for you, so every page that you make goes into this little folder, and so everything is kept together. That way when you're ready to publish things to the web, everything is kept together and nice and neat and organized. You can change your code manually if you need to. A lot of the GUI editors will allow you to change and modify your code. So if you aren't happy with something or want to add something, you can do so because you know how to do it. And it allows you to focus on the design without any focus on the HTML. It is more focused on how it looks than what's actually in it. So keep that in mind. It's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing. Some of the cons or negatives of GUI editors. Some will alter or ignore any code you enter manually and may not recognize every HTML tag, especially if it's a new tag. So that's something to keep in mind, that if you do use a GUI editor, it may not always be the latest version of HTML. And that could be good or bad depending on what you need. A lot of them have not come up with HTML versions, and as such, they may not have the latest tags and changes. Often, it will create excessive code that makes the page very bulky. When I say bulky, I'm talking about very large in terms of the amount of code that's put into there. And it can make your page download slower because of the fact that there's so much for it to process. So you might want to check your code before you actually publish it to the web. And then lastly, the alternate attribute, we talked about this in our images unit. You need to make sure you have that in your code, and in some of the GUI editors, that's completely missing, or it's not emphasized. Remember that all attributes used in case your image doesn't show up, it can still code the image and still have the image without there actually being the image available. And so that all is just the text that would be the placeholder in case your picture doesn't show up. And it's also required for users who do have disabilities, so it doesn't really mention it, and it's important you have that. So before we end this lesson, some cautions. They're great. GUIs, the text presents a very good balanced view of HTML editors versus GUI editors. Me, myself, I prefer the GUI editors, but as the text mentions, and as I just mentioned in the previous slides, you have to be very careful about what you choose because you need to make it about what your project needs and what you're most comfortable with. They're not always going to load and edit code with newer tags, and sometimes you could lose your work because you changed something and something just completely messes up. So be careful when you edit your pages in a GUI editor. Always, always, always save your work. Make backup copies just in case you do mess something up using a GUI editor. You can go back, fix it, and change it. So I don't want to sound dramatic here, but GUI editors are very helpful and very beneficial. And they're much easier if you want to start making a web page and get a web page done quickly. Just again, be very careful about what you use them for and pick what you're most comfortable with. So in summary, there are many pros and cons to text editors and GUI editors. And again, I've said it multiple times, you have to pick what you're most comfortable with and what's going to meet the needs of your project. Keep in mind that if you do work for a web design company and you decide to do web design professionally, you're definitely going to want to use a program like Dreamweaver because of the fact that you'll be able to turn out web pages quickly and they'll look phenomenally without you having to do hours and hours and hours of code. All right, that's going to do it for this lesson.